But that left the problem of time. In less than 8 days, weather depending, Clays was going to be home with the bad news. Somehow, someway, I needed to get out of here before that happened. In the end, I saw that I had 2 options. Either I escaped by myself or waited for Timothy to come after me. I did not flatter myself that Timothy would be back solely for my own pitiful rescue, but I knew that he'd be wanting his precious seal returned. When he discovered that neither I nor the seal were actually heading downriver toward Easton, then he'd be back here in a hurry. I lay down on the floor and relaxed. Why risk my own life by trying to escape when Timothy could do the job better? If nothing else, he could bargain with Ben Redcliffe by digging into his own private funds to get me out, and he would too if he ever wanted to see that seal again. I just hoped he wouldn't take too long figuring out what happened to me. Focusing on the spots of sky above me, I finally began to doze. A few minutes later, I was asleep. I woke up to the sound of thunder. I opened my eyes just as a plume of blue light flashed over the hut. The air buzzed, and I felt the ground rumble. I sat up, gasping for air. It wasn't the lightning storm I was frightened of, but how hot and thin the atmosphere had grown. I leaned over to one of the gaps in the hut and pressed my mouth to it. The air outside wasn't much better, but at least there was more of it. I breathed in deeply, trying to replenish my lungs. The camp outside was mostly empty, everyone having gone inside for shelter. The giant lightning rods, like lonely sentries, were vibrating, making a dim humming that sounded like the bass section of an all-men's choir. Listening to the strange music, I lay back down. This was a sound that no one in the West ever got to hear. Yes, there was lightning in the West, but not like here. In Ottleton, the lightning came down in little spindly threads, flashing only now and then across small sections of the sky. But here the blue-white explosions of electricity ruptured in showery blasts that shook the world and lit the entire sky like noonday. And always with it came the humming of lightning rods. Depending on the height of each individual lightning rod, the music ranged from highs to lows. At home, our lightning rods had been specially ordered to hum in harmony. Those rods had come to seem like great protective giants to me, absorbing the explosions, while at the same time singing calming, wordless lullabies. The strange song had its effect here, too. I fell asleep once more. The next time I woke up, it was not because of the storm, but rather because someone was tapping me softly on the toes of my shoes. I sat up and saw Charlie sitting in the open doorway of the hut. It was much later in the afternoon by now, perhaps even close to dinner time. My stomach began to growl. He looked anxiously at me, and then opened a dirty scarf in his hands. Inside were 3 more oatcakes. "I brought you these," he said, handing the scarf to me. "Thank you," I said, setting my supper down on my lap. I glanced outside and saw that the storm had passed, leaving only dark gray clouds behind. "Would you like to share?" He shook his head. "They're for you." "Well, come in and keep me company while I eat." He crawled inside and looked around at all the gaps in the walls. "What happened to this place?" I shrugged. "Termites, I guess." His eyes widened. "Those must be really big termites." "Big as mice, probably," I said, following his train of thought. "How does your leg feel?" He reached down and touched the bandage gingerly. "It still hurts a little." He looked up. "Mama says you live in a big house down in the valley in the town where my grandmam and grandpappy live." "That's right, I know them. I used to go to your grandparents' house sometimes when I was little. Your grandma taught me a song. It went like this. Moody, moody, moo, the horse has lost his shoe. The cow, she stole it, and she sold it. Moody, moody, moo." He stared at me and then suddenly laughed. "I never heard that song. There's more words. Would you like to hear it?" "Yes." I taught him all 3 verses, and before long he could sing it by himself. After that, he begged me to teach him more songs. I taught him the one that Sir John Robert taught me when I was Charlie's age, the one about the bat out of hell. Sir John Robert made me swear not to tell my parents, which I never did. But once Nanny Barb caught me singing it to the bird she kept in a cage in her room, and she whipped me soundly on the hands for knowing such a wicked song. She threatened me with all kinds of torture if I didn't tell her who had taught it to me, but I never did. "Just don't sing it where your mother can hear," I said to Charlie after teaching him. "You have to promise, because she would never approve." "I won't." "Good boy." I was just about to ask if he might find me another oatcake when a horn sounded somewhere nearby in the woods, a long, crooked sound. Charlie scrambled for the entrance of the hut. "I've got to go." "Why?" I said, catching his sleeve. "What is it?" "Someone's coming." He wriggled out of my grip and started out of my little prison, only to stop at the sight of several horses coming into the camp. I tried to look over his head. "Who is it?" He waited so long to answer that I thought he was ignoring me, but then suddenly he declared, "It's the sheriff, and he has a lot of Westies with him." "Westies? Are they soldiers?" "I think so, Westie kind. My papa says that the sheriff likes the Westies because they pay him lots of money." I climbed out beside him so that we were both perched on the doorway, with our feet dangling over the stilted entrance. From here we watched the parade of strangers invading the camp of Robber Redcliffe. The first few were locals, but the rest of them were uniformed soldiers. I knew them at once, King's Guard. I'd seen enough of them in uniform around the castle to recognize the unique insignias. I looked back to the local men. The foremost of them was a man with ginger hair and a mustache. This would be the sheriff. "I'm going to see what's happening," I said, starting to leave the hut. But Charlie reached out his little hand and clung to my skirt. "Don't! The sheriff's not a nice man. He told me he was going to put me in jail one day." "Then you stay here. He won't hurt me." Charlie let go of my dress, but he didn't look convinced. With my hands in my coat pockets, I crossed to the cabin, where there was a wood stack just high enough for me to hide behind. Ben Redcliffe was already greeting the sheriff as the man dismounted. "What is all this? I pay my dues in full." "Now, don't get yourself in a panic, Redcliffe. I'm not here for tariffs. I'm just guiding these men through the forest today. They have a few questions for you, is all." I peeked over the pile of logs. My captor was about to be grilled, and I didn't want to miss a second of it. Only then one of the uniformed Westies climbed down from his horse, and I gave a happy gasp. Jumping up from my hiding place, I started forward. "George!" I cried, not believing my good luck. George and I were acquainted through his younger brother Edward, who attended the same college as I did. I'd been to their home for several parties, and though George and I had never been close, he would no doubt come to my rescue now. He spun around and spotted me. To say he was surprised would be an understatement. "Lisbette?" I skipped down the path. "You're the last person I expected to see here." He was looking at my clothes. "Me? What in the world are you doing here?" I looked at his clothes, too. I had seen him in dress uniform before, but today he was in fatigues. "I was on my way home," I explained, "when I got waylaid. But now you're here, I'm sure you can help me out." "We were looking for—" He paused, still eyeing me strangely. I took advantage of his hesitation to scan over the rest of the men with him to see if there was anyone else I knew. That was when I spotted two men in the back who weren't on horseback, Timothy and Richard. Their wrists were bound in ropes. George was watching me as he continued. "We were searching for a girl who was traveling with those two men." Richard was looking very sour, but I could swear that Timothy was all but biting his tongue. I could almost hear the question that was on his mind. "Where is the box?" I dug my hands deeper into my coat pockets and looked back at George. "Well, you found her," I said blithesomely. "You?" It wasn't just George who was staring at me now. Ben, the sheriff, and every one of those uniformed men were gaping at me as if I had just pulled a rabbit from my hat. I smiled winningly at George. I knew why he was surprised. He and his men were obviously here for the seal. They wouldn't have to question either Timothy or Richard to know a girl had been traveling with them. Enough people had seen us together to supply him with that information. Obviously, George was fretting over the idea that I, a girl his mother had entertained at his own house, was an accomplice. Well, I would just have to clear that up. Carefully, of course. I didn't see any reason to let on that I knew what was in the box. That's right, I was out of money, and I needed to get home. Since Timothy's family and mine are neighbors, I asked him if he'd help me out. It was a lucky thing I caught him when I did. He was just on his way out the door when I found him yesterday. Of course, that was before I knew he was being chased by the army. George's shoulders relaxed a fraction. "King's Guard," he corrected me. "Mr. Easton was carrying a box when he crossed the border check, but he no longer seems to have that box. You wouldn't know where the box is, would you?" "Yes," I said. "I threw it in the river." George and all his companions reacted much the same way, mouths wide open and all of them staring at me as if I'd just confessed to murder. Richard and Timothy were no less taken aback. I could see the color draining out of Timothy's face. "Why?" George asked as soon as he found his voice. "Why did you do that?" "Because I knew that whatever was in that box didn't belong to Timothy, and if he had really stolen it, I didn't want him to get away with it. Of course now I see that this might have been rash, but, well, the deed is done, as they say. I suppose you might still be able to find it. It was heavy enough that the current might not have carried it too far. But then again, it is spring, and the river was swollen." George's face hardened. "You're going to have to show me where you threw that box into the river." "Naturally, I'd be delighted. Of course you'll have to ask Mr. Redcliffe's permission. At the moment, I'm his prisoner." "Well, now you're my prisoner. If Mr. Redcliffe has any problems with this, he can answer to the royal family." Ben scowled and glanced at the sheriff. "Prisoner?" he asked bitterly. "Why, Miss Blackwood was merely my guest. Naturally, you may take her." The sheriff grinned.